So what we can say is humanism is the basic doctrine or worldview, and humanism, its practical form is capitalism. And humanism is the doctrine that human beings are God. So this is self worship of humanity. Now this self worship can take different forms. Self worship, and it also depends on your conception of self. So self worship, so you worship self, but your conception of self will determine who you are actually worshipping. So liberalism says that your true self, so the notion of true self is important. Your true self is your individual self. Okay. So in liberalism, what you worship is your own self, and the form it takes generally is sovereignty of desire. So you want to fulfill your desires as much as possible, and this is a form of self-worship. This is liberalism. Now, other views: socialism, nationalism. These are the views which are called communitarianism, as against individualism. So both communitarianism and individualism both are form of humanism and self-worship, but their conception of self is different. So in individualism, your true self is your individual self, but in communitarianism, your individual self is not your true self. Your true self is your communal self. So your individual self is part of an organic whole. That's communal self. And what you want to do is, since that is your truth, so your idea is to worship that communal self. So basically collapse your own self into that communal self. And what you worship is your communal self, not your individual self as such. And sovereignty of desire is here too, but desire is not necessarily individual desire, but individual desires are subservient to communal desires and communal self. And sovereignty of desire is still here, but that's the desire of the communal self. Now your communal self, in socialism, it is a species being, that humans as species. So what you worship is not your own self, but humanity. That's why communists and socialists like Trotsky, if you read their biography, obviously they were making a lot of sacrifices and all that, and they thought that they will live forever, not as individual self, but their self will live in the self of the humanity. Yeah. So they were trying to eternalize themselves by collapsing themselves into humanity. So the purpose of sacrifice was to dissolve themselves, dissolve your individual self, which is just a fleeting self, into your true self, which is humanity. And to take the form that this communal self actually is manifested in proletariat, laborers, workers, and in fact, eventually it is manifested in the party which represents the proletariat, and eventually in the leader, Lenin or Stalin. Or okay, so that's the communitarian. Socialism is the one form of communitarianism. Now, nationalism. Obviously, it's a nation is a old view, but in modern humanistic form, nationalism is a form of communitarianism. And you said that your individual self is not your true self. Your true self is your national self. So you don't necessarily try to establish the sovereignty of your individual desire, but the desire of the nation. As compared to socialism, for example, nationalism is a particularistic movement because its community is limited to a nation, but it is a form of communitarianism, as against individual. And like socialism, although you say obviously there are many different forms of nationalism, but in fascism, national self is actually reflected in personified in the leader, the Führer, Mussolini or Hitler. So you worship Mussolini because that's you. He is the sort of manifestation of or incarnation of the national self, like Jesus is the incarnation of God. So in that sense, fascism is obviously opposed to liberalism very much because liberal is individualism. I say the individualism, self-worship and worshipping your own self is basically weakening your nation. But you also reject socialism because your real self is not the humanity, but your national self. And maybe your nation is actually representative of humanity, like you are the real humans and other humanities are at some lower level, etc. So, but socialism, nationalism, and liberalism, they are all form of humanism. They are form of self-worship. The difference is the self. For liberalism is individual. For socialism is proletariat, manifested in the party and its leadership. And in nationalism, it is nation. And in fascism, which is a form of nationalism, it is manifested in the leader. The leader might be, Mussolini or Hitler or Al Hussein, or depends on, these are, etc. And so their humanism, form of self-worship, but their conception of self. And self-worship takes the form of freedom, search for freedom. So in liberalism, freedom, search for fulfillment of your desire. That's what freedom is. Overcoming the limits on your desires. And the basic limit is scarcity. That's why capitalism is so important. But in liberalism, freedom of the individual. In socialism, the freedom of the proletariat or humanity eventually. And in nationalism, it is the freedom of a particular nation, Okay. So this is a summary of the relationship between humanism and its three different forms.